Our next speaker is Alan Rettig. Her Sherlockian since childhood, Alan is invested in the Baker Street Irregulars as the Red Lamp and is a longtime member of the Red Circle of Washington, where he serves as webmaster. He is also a member of the Sherlock Holmes Society of London and has spoken at numerous Sherlockian meetings and conferences. His topic is going to be "And So Down Under, a Ballarat Odyssey."
Thank you. Just my luck, I have to follow a Karen Wilson song. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Glad to be here, and I'm really glad that the slides seem to be working, which is a real good thing. This little talk falls under the heading of Write What You Know, or in this case, Tell What You Know, because it's mostly about a personal adventure. But the story begins long before I was around, back in 1850 and the start of the Australian gold rush. The gold mined in Australia between 1850 and 1870 and exported where else, to Britain, paid off all the empire's foreign debts and laid the groundwork for her enormous commercial expansion in the latter half of the 19th century. Now, by the early 1860s, two men, drawn by gold fever to the mining towns of Ballarat, would set in motion the chain of events that concluded some 3 decades later with Sherlock Holmes solving the Boscombe Valley Mystery. You'll recall this iconic Paget illustration of Holmes and Watson on the train bound for the valley, where the clash of John Turner and Charles McCarthy back in Ballarat held the key to solving the mystery of McCarthy's death. It was when I was in the 6th or 7th grade that my favorite uncle handed me the 2-volume Doubleday edition of the Complete Holmes. There's my Uncle George. He was a great guy. He was a professor of civil engineering. He was an amateur violinist and a damn good one. And he was, of course, a Sherlockian. He also got to run out some of the working drawings for the George Washington Bridge way back when. So he was quite a guy. But in any event, he said one day to me, he said, "Here, kiddo, you'll like this." And that's how I got hooked on The Great Detective. And we cannot let this slide go by or talk of the complete Sherlock Holmes Doubleday edition without talking about Christopher Morley's preface to that edition, in which he says, when he wanted to read about Arthur Conan Doyle, he came right here. He came right here to the Pratt. And it's there for all to see if you care to read it. It's a wonderful, wonderful preface if you haven't read it lately. Well, it was some 5 decades later that I got hooked on genealogy, and I fell just as hard for that as I did for Sherlock Holmes. Little did I know that when I started researching my mother's family, I'd find any number of connections between my ancestors and the exploits of Sherlock Holmes. I wrote about my Sherlockian family tree in last winter's Baker Street Journal, so you may have read about those touch points. But today I'll be expanding on just one of them, my family connection to the Australian Gold Rush, Ballarat, and Blackjack Turner. Back at the beginning of the gold fever in 1850, it was alluvial gold found right on the surface in places like Ararat, Bendigo, Castlemaine, and Ballarat, that triggered the frenzy in those precincts around Melbourne. The nuggets were there for the taking, sometimes by themselves, sometimes embedded in quartz. Smaller flakes were harvested with the time-tested tools of pans and sluice boxes. The non-Indigenous population of the Melbourne area exploded from 29,000 in 1851 to 123,000 just 3 years later. But before long, the alluvial gold literally panned out, and it was necessary to dig for the rest. This was the time for serious engineering efforts and just plain hard work. And I absolutely love this image. How many guys does it take to dig a hole? One to supervise, one to read the paper, and one to dig. And of course, the tea kettle must be close at hand. But in fact, the digging was fierce and productive. By the early 1860s, about 200,000 pounds of gold a year, that's 100 tons, were extracted from the Melbourne goldfields. It was during this incredible boom time that the infamous John Turner, aka Black Jack of Ballarat, stopped working his own claim, formed an outlaw gang, and began a notorious second career as a highwayman. One day, Turner's gang held up a gold convoy driven by Charles McCarthy and killed at least 4 of the guards. But Turner spared McCarthy, an unexplained act of mercy that he would come to regret. 30 years later in the Boscombe Valley, Turner would finish the job and kill McCarthy, who had himself become a villainous blackmailer. Of course, there were many twists and turns in the case, and it would take Sherlock Holmes to sort everything out and see that a form of rough justice was done. Well, my own genealogical journey started about 12 years ago, when a friend who was a seasoned family historian gave me a tutorial and set me off on my adventure. After much research and much travel, I wound up with a 30,000-word book tracing my mother's family. Like all family researchers, along the way I encountered my share of mysteries, some of them worthy of Holmes himself. One of them involved my second great-grandfather, William Mill. I knew that William was born in Cornwall, England in 1825. He was a tin miner and had 2 kids. But in 1856, he disappeared from the little Cornish town of Illugan, leaving his wife and kids behind, and I couldn't figure out where he went. I assumed he'd come to America like most of my other ancestors, but I just couldn't track him down. Now, from the start, I had planted my family tree in cyberspace like most genealogists do. There you can see over on the left, there's me and family and my mom, Dorothy, my grandma, Emily, my great-grandma, Elizabeth Mill, and then over here, her father, William Mill, my second great-grandfather, and his wife, Jane Harris. Well, it wasn't long after my tree went online that I got an email from a most unexpected place. Margaret Joyce Mill MacDonald from Adelaide, Australia, wrote to tell me that she'd been following my tree online. What are the odds? Margaret introduced herself as a longtime volunteer with the South Australia Genealogy and Heraldry Society, aka Genealogy SA. And she wanted me to know that I'd been looking in the wrong place for William Mill. He hadn't come to America. Instead, he boarded the clipper Queen of the Seas and 5 months later arrived at Melbourne's Port Phillip Bay. He worked in Australia for the rest of his life as a miner and a mine manager. Looking at her own tree and mine, Margaret had quickly determined that she and I are second cousins once removed. And she sent me her full dossier on William Mill. And it had that photo in it, not much of a photo, but what are you going to do? Well, as shocking as it was to hear from Margaret, it was positively stunning to find that for his first decade in Australia, William had labored in the gold mines of Ballarat. Wow, the news literally made me shiver. Now, we all know that Sherlockian chronologists argue endlessly about the dates of the adventures, a pastime that shows no sign of slowing down. Baring Gould says that the Boscombe Valley Mystery took place on the 8th and 9th of June, 1889. Others disagree. But remember, Black Jack Turner ambushed Charles McCarthy and liberated his gold decades earlier. Happily for me, Turner began his confession with these words, dutifully recorded by Watson. It was in the early 60s at the diggings. Simple arithmetic. My second great-grandfather, William Mill, arrived at Ballarat in 1857 and spent at least a decade there. Clearly, he was there for all of the early 60s. Is it reasonable to imagine that William knew John Turner or Charles McCarthy? Certainly it is. And if he didn't know Turner, he surely knew of him, for Black Jack's gang was utterly notorious. And so it came to pass that I added detail to my own family tree and an entire branch to my Sherlockian family tree. But the adventure didn't end there. Throughout our long string of correspondence, my newfound cousin Margaret virtually insisted that Terry and I come to Australia and pay a visit. She didn't have to twist our arms too hard. Unlike Grandpa William, we decided not to spend 140 days on a clipper ship. We chose another ship with a queen in her name that was more appropriate to the adventure. Cunard's Queen Victoria. What else? We crossed from California to Sydney, and after a visit there, flew to Melbourne and made our way to Ballarat. 1910 marked the last serious gold rush in those Victoria goldfields, and today, Ballarat caters largely to the tourist trade. Even so, the surge in gold prices just after the beginning of this century rekindled the fever in both Bendigo and Ballarat, where some commercial mining is still to be found. The Sovereign Hill mine is still the center of business in Ballarat. A journey to the depths was a highlight. And we were lucky to be on hand for a pour, as Gold Bar was created for export. There's no doubt about it, in the mining towns surrounding Melbourne, gold is still a driving force. Now, we didn't go off prospecting on our own, but it's clear from this advisory that seekers of fortune, whether casual or serious, are still looking to strike it rich. I don't know if you can read it, but I'll read it for you. Always be wary when you are walking when gold detecting in the bush, as there are lots of unexpected open mine shafts throughout the area. You will also encounter uneven ground, slippery clay in wet weather, and there is always the prospect of encountering snakes in summer. Always let someone know where you are going before heading out bush. And I might add, make sure your will is up to date. In the center of town, the Ballarat Times newspaper is still in business and still uses its massive letterpress. In addition to the paper, the Times prints posters to order, and I had one made up to commemorate my Sherlockian connection. When he handed it to me, the printer said, "Here you are, Mr. Turner." "I think it looks just grand," he said. Well, I agreed that it does look grand, but I had to tell him that I'm not Mr. Turner. When I told him of the Boscombe Valley Mystery, he said he'd get it from the library and read it over his evening tea. And I still take pleasure that the bottom of the poster reads, "Printed by Ballarat Times, Sovereign Hill Gold Mining Township, Ballarat." And as I'm sure you know, in the world of Sherlock Holmes, sometimes things have their own way of going viral. I'm sure that some of you know Gene Upton and Roger Johnson, the London Holmesians who, among many other things, are in charge of curating the Sherlock Holmes sitting room in the pub of the same name at number 10 Northumberland Street there in London. The sitting room is a marvelous place that had its beginnings as part of the 1952 Festival of Britain celebration, which in a real way became the genesis of the Sherlock Holmes Society of London. On a visit to London just before COVID, I gave a copy of the poster to Roger and Jean. Not long after, they sent me this photo of the bulletin board in that fabled room, half a world away from Ballarat. Well, we had one more stop to make on our Australian odyssey. Another quick flight, and we were in Adelaide, where we spent some quality time with my newfound cousin Margaret and her husband Dean. What do you think? Is there a family resemblance? I don't know. In any case, I'll always be in Margaret's debt for finding my grandpa William Mill and for jump-starting my Ballarat odyssey. "Farewell then," said Black Jack to Holmes and Watson. And with that, I come full circle on my Australian adventure. Thank you for letting me share it with you.